Hi, good evening and welcome everyone. We're just gonna wait a minute or two for everyone to join and then we'll get started.
Les damos la bienvenida. Vamos a esperar un minuto o dos y empezaremos en breve. Before we begin our webinar, I would like to ground us in our language justice commitment. Antes de comenzar con nuestro seminario web, vamos a centrarnos en lo que es nuestro compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje. STAND-L.A is committed to language justice, which is the right that every person has to participate in the language they feel most comfortable and most free in. STAND-L.A está comprometida, como coalición está comprometida a la justicia del lenguaje, que es el derecho que toda persona tiene para participar en el idioma que siente mayor comodidad y libertad. And language justice is a shared responsibility. And so we are asking all of our panelists today to be mindful of their speed, be very intentional so that everything can be interpreted as accurately as possible. La justicia del lenguaje es una responsabilidad compartida y por eso le pedimos a todas las personas panelistas el día de hoy que sean muy intencionales en su velocidad a la hora de expresarse para que todo lo que se diga se interprete de la manera más precisa posible. In a moment, everyone will receive a message that says that there's interpretation available. If you're on a computer, you will see an icon at the bottom of your screen and you will select English if that's the language that you'd like to participate in. En un momento vamos a habilitar la función de interpretación y van a ver un icono en la parte inferior de la pantalla y van a poder seleccionar español para poder escuchar toda la información en español. If you're on a cell phone, it will be in the three dots that say more, and then you can make your language selection. Si están en un teléfono celular, van a ir a los 3 puntos donde dice más, y ahí van a poder elegir interpretación y el idioma. And so we will enable the feature now and wait just a couple of seconds so that participants can select their language preference. And in the chat, in the questions, we will also try to help with translating any questions that come in the Q&A. Vamos a habilitar la función de interpretación. Si hay preguntas en español, las vamos a estar traduciendo en la función de preguntas y respuestas. Gracias. Thank you.
Okay, so hopefully everyone has been able to go ahead and select the language. And this is just a reminder as we proceed. If you have a question, please go ahead and put it into the chat on Zoom and we can keep track of those. So, once again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening as our panelists discuss the urgent need to uplift environmental justice in Los Angeles and indeed everywhere, particularly as we look at the health and other impacts of neighborhood oil drilling, climate driven wildfires, and the climate crisis. The panelists will also discuss recent legal and policy developments, and we'll share with you what you can do to support our campaign for LA City's readoption of the ordinance to phase out neighborhood oil drilling. A bit about STAND-L.A itself. STAND-L.A has been around for a bit more than 10 years, with all of us, advocates and impacted community members from LA's frontline communities, with all of us coming together to tell the city enough is enough. Neighborhood oil drilling is fundamentally incompatible with human health. The oil industry's practice of drilling where we live, where we gather with friends and family, where we raise our children and go to school, it has poisoned our homes and communities. It has poisoned us, and it has got to stop. That's why STAND-L.A embarked on this campaign nearly 10 years long that successfully got the city of LA to vote to phase out oil drilling. And that means that finally people and their health have been prioritized over industry profits. An industry that for so long just shamelessly created sacrifice zones out of our neighborhoods, mostly low-income communities of color. And they did this merely to increase their own profits. Now, unfortunately, last fall, an LA Superior Court judge sided with the oil industry on overturning this ordinance. But all hope is not lost. We still have hope because despite the setback, there remains a clear path for LA City Council to reintroduce and pass a new ordinance. And we have to act fast. Climate change and the climate crisis will not wait for us. People's health just cannot wait. Also, we just want to say that with the current wildfires, we have seen what can happen when we ignore environmental justice and the climate crisis. We have seen firsthand that the fossil fuel industry has simultaneously poisoned our homes and communities and has also driven climate change that has led to increasingly harmful climate disasters. It has increased the vulnerability of frontline communities to even more harm to their health, harm to their housing, from the various institutions, private and public, that shape our neighborhoods. And that's why we're here to say that we need immediate action to prevent further harm and emphasize the disproportionate impact on frontline communities. So this is what you're going to hear from our panelists. Lastly, we also just want to take a moment to acknowledge certain harmful issues and, of course, the potential community-based and community-benefiting solutions that go hand in hand with what we're discussing today, but that we won't have time to go into today. These include the increased vulnerability of communities, such as those impacted by the Eden fire, to land speculation, to more gentrification, and to displacement. We also want to acknowledge that we know and we have seen that there are strong community-led efforts out there to prevent this, and we encourage all of you here to learn more about it. So now we're going to just come back and we're going to hear a brief message from Assembly Member Isaac Bryan, who represents parts of South Los Angeles and Culver City, including the Inglewood oil field.
STAND-L.A. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you in person. It's Assembly Member Isaac Bryan, the 55th Assembly District. A lot of you know me. I know a lot of you. I represent Los Angeles and the Inglewood oil field, which through your advocacy and through your leadership through the years, you've been able to shut down Culver City's portion, the city of Los Angeles' portion, the county's portion, and finally the state has stepped up with AB 2716 to shut down the entire field by 2030. Our climate crisis is real, and you all know that. But it's not just real, it's urgent. We deserve a future. We deserve clean air and clean water and a healthy environment. We deserve a sustainable planet. But more importantly, we're willing to fight for it. You are willing to fight for it. It is the frontline communities that have been impacted by harm by neighborhood oil drilling and environmental hazards for decades. That's who's carried this weight. That is who we need to fight for. I want to thank you for all of your years of advocacy. It is the young people in this movement, it is the communities that have been impacted. That is where real change is going to come from. And I think it's my job, and I see it as elected officials' job, to uplift you, to center you in this conversation, and to work in partnership and collaboration. Change doesn't just happen. We make it happen. You make it happen. You have an ally in me. You have a legislative champion in me. Whatever I can do to help us move towards the future that we all deserve, I'm going to do. So thank you all for coming together. And again, I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm always with you. Much love.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Assemblymember Brian. And now we're moving over to Aretha. Aretha Walmsley is a proud South Central native who has been a dedicated member of SCOPE for over 15 years and a longtime member of STAND-L.A. With deep roots in her community, Aretha has tirelessly fought for environmental justice, health equity, and an end to neighborhood oil drilling. And as a co-chair of the Air Quality and Oil Drilling Committee and a volunteer coordinator and team lead for SCOPE's Street Action Team, she has helped mobilize countless residents in the fight for clean air and healthy neighborhoods. A powerful voice for justice, Aretha brings her lived experience as a Black woman to the forefront of the movement, speaking truth to power and advocating for those too often ignored. Aretha, can you go ahead and unmute
Yes,
yourself?
thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. My name is Aretha Wormsley. I am a proud of South Central native, a mother, someone who has been fighting for justice in my community for over 15 years with Scope and STAND-L.A. South LA is under constant attack from toxic pollution and over policing, disinvestment, and systemic neglect. We're living next to oil drilling sites, facing ice raids in our communities, and dealing with climate disasters like wildfires in our neighborhoods. We are exhausted and we're done being ignored. I used to have friends and family that lived near oil drilling sites. They would say, "Oh, my son has a nosebleed," or "My daughter is not feeling well, her asthma," and I was wondering why, why is this happening? I know so many children with asthma, so many families suffering silently from the same harm. It's inhumane and it has to stop. Big oil doesn't want us to win. They see our pain and they still choose profit over people. They want to keep us sick, silent, sacrificed, but we're not disposable. We're powerful and we are organized. As a co chair of the Air Quality and Oil Drilling Campaign, and a team lead with Scope Street Action Team. I've organized, I've knocked on doors, I've trained volunteers, and I've raised my voice to demand justice. I've been doing this work for over a decade because I believe in South LA. We have to stop drilling. We will replace those wells and we will hold these polluters accountable. And we must build South LA, make it safe and healthy and whole for us and for our generations to come after us. My mission is to make sure that South Los Angeles gets the quality of life we deserve. We are not a dumping ground. As long as I have breath in my body, I will keep fighting to put people over profit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aretha. That was really powerful, and we are honored that you took a moment to share with us what your experience has been and also what you've been doing. So thank you again for that. Now, actually, we're going to go over to our panelists. And before we begin that, I'm going to introduce our three panelists today. First off, we have Ashley Hernandez with Communities for a Better Environment. Ashley grew up within walking distance from the Wilmington oil rig, and at a very young age, she learned how exposure to toxic fumes made her sick. She is a youth organizer with Communities for a Better Environment, and for the past decade has been fighting to ban drilling near homes, schools, and hospitals. Today, we also have Maya Golden-Krasner with Center for Biological Diversity. She is the Deputy Director of the Climate Law Institute at the Center for Biological Diversity, where she fights to protect people, wildlife, and the planet from climate change and fossil fuels. Before joining the center, Maya was an attorney at Communities for a Better Environment, where she advocated for environmental justice in California's low-income communities of color. She's also an adjunct lecturer at the UCLA School of Law, where she has taught environmental justice law and California environmental law. And we also have today Bhavna Shamasunder from UCSB. Bhavna is a professor of just, resilient, and sustainable city futures in the Environmental Studies program at UC Santa Barbara. She conducts research in partnership with communities who live on the front lines of industrial pollution and has worked for over a decade on examining the health consequences of urban oil extraction in Los Angeles. So welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. So we have some questions for all of you and for everyone else on this webinar. We're going to go through these questions. And then afterwards, just a reminder for all of you who have additional questions for the panelists, please type it into the Zoom chat itself, because afterwards we'll have about 10 minutes to ask some of those questions of our panelists as well. So thank you again, Ashley, Bhavna, and Maya. Our first question, Ashley, is for you. And it is, what are the daily realities and immediate health impacts experienced by communities living near oil drilling sites?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we always want to make sure LA residents keep in mind when we're thinking about our air quality is that, it hasn't just become this issue because of climate disasters, but, frontline communities like Wilmington and many of the ones that are represented by STAND-L.A. Are dealing with a lot of impacts related to the oil and gas industry. Wilmington is where I live. It's where I work. And I think the reality for a lot of us residents here, it's a business as usual approach, right? While our communities are juggling a climate crisis, we also have a health crisis. We have a housing crisis, right? I think we are in this room are really aware of the issues that are affecting our city. And, as a frontline resident, like I see that burden weighing heavy in our residents, right? We have respiratory issues, we have cancer, we have bronchitis, birthing issues, reproductive issues. I got into this work because I was one of those kids growing up in this area, not really knowing why all of us in our grade school years were put up against a wall with toilet paper up our nose. Like it was just a typical part of our day, having nosebleeds, having headaches, having sick mentors, teachers, and loved ones. And so I think one of the things that's really important to us as leaders, but also as environmental justice advocates and organizers, is to make sure that folks don't forget that this health crisis has been happening for such a long time, and our communities have just been seeking for some relief, right? We want to make sure that we can take a deep breath. We want to make sure that our communities are not just labeled sacrifice zones, but areas where we can thrive. And I think a lot of LA residents here know that a lot of communities don't get that ability. And so, I think for me, the reality of living near oil and gas means I have explosions, we have gas leaks, we have massive health issues, and then we have the reality of a climate crisis that's impending and definitely also creating impact on frontline communities where we just can't bounce back. And so, aside from health, we definitely have many layers here and many cumulative impacts that, impact our health in Wilmington refineries. A poor, but, neighborhood oil drilling is what makes Wilmington ground zero. And so, for communities that have oil and gas, the reality is this business as usual approach. We get sick and we're still expected to keep on going. And so I hope here folks are able to see that we have an ability to readopt a policy in the city of LA to make sure that we protect the health of LA and all of those growing up in impacted neighborhoods.
Thanks so much, Ashley. I mean, it is quite something to hear that our fellow Angelenos and so many kids are being expected by the rest of the city, whether intentionally or just silent acceptance, that they have to hold the burden of this so that the rest of us can just go on with our lives. So thank you for sharing that. Maya, can you share a bit with us about your experience as an Altadena resident impacted by the recent LA fires?
Sure. So I live in Northwest Altadena, which is proudly, I think, a diverse area. There's everyone there from scientists at JPL and Caltech to artists to middle-class folks and extended families, including Black families who could once afford to buy houses there and were redlined out of other places. It's not perfect. It faces many of the social and environmental justice issues of other places, but it feels like a kind of a small town. I don't know, maybe because a lot of us have lived there a long time and we're a little bit quirky and we're tucked up against the foothills. But on January 7th, we actually evacuated early, maybe around 9 p.m. Because there's one road in and out of my neighborhood and trees were already coming down, and our hyper local weather guy, Edgar McGregor, said that there's a huge fire risk. So we got out, and then after calling a bunch of hotels, which are extremely expensive, we ended up at a friend's one-room ADU, and we've been there ever since. And we're so lucky because our house is still standing, but we have lead in the ash in our house. And so we're still waiting for insurance to approve remediation. And at first I couldn't go up to the house because I have asthma does my daughter, and we had trouble breathing. We also live pretty far up into the foothills. So we sort of, I don't know if expected, but that our house might succumb to fire one day, but like if of any of the places in Altadena, like it seems more likely. We have a fire safe council for our neighborhood. What we didn't expect was that the rest of our community was going to be gone. And this fire was just so hot and the winds were so fierce that it spread so rapidly and quickly. One of my best friends' houses burned down. A bunch of my friends lost their houses. Our synagogue burned down, which was also where our kids went to grade school. Just like a bunch of places that we like to eat and gather and see community shows with our neighbors, they're all gone. It's devastating.
Wow, really sorry to hear that, Maya. But thank you for sharing that with us.
Welcome to the climate crisis.
Right, indeed. Welcome to the climate crisis. Bhavna, this next one is for you. Can you clarify the specific public health threats oil drilling poses, particularly to vulnerable communities? And can you talk a little bit about the health harms of the fires and the implications for Angelenos already impacted by health issues due to oil extraction?
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. It's an evening. I know that people have long, busy days, but it's a really important issue in Los Angeles and has been for 100 years. And it's in the last 15 years that we've really fought for more information about what is happening in neighborhoods. And so, in the interest of time, I'll just say that there's a very large literature on the public health impacts of living nearby oil extraction. It's large and growing, and there's a substantive body of information, and there's both things that are strongly correlated, as well as causal information that we know. But in Los Angeles, there's a large population that lives nearby active oil extraction. And we know that extraction, the process itself produces multiple emissions of health hazardous pollutants. So benzene, ethylbenzene, xylene, formaldehyde, hydrogen sulfide, particulate matter, oxides of nitrogen, methylene chlorides. And nearby communities have an increased risk of exposure to air, water, noise, soil, and light pollution. And these compounds are known to be toxic to human health. They can be carcinogenic, cause respiratory harm, many of the things Ashley's community faces, or can pose developmental or reproductive harm that you see, in reproductive health outcomes. And these problems are compounded when there are challenges in enforcement. There hasn't been updating of the site, even as drilling continues. And these challenges are much more common in communities that have other cumulative burdens. So poverty, people who face language barriers, who live near other polluting sources, or where there are disproportionately renters. So we know that proximity matters, and the closer communities live to active oil and gas development, the worse it is for their health. And we found in our own research that living near active and even recently closed wells was associated with lower lung function. So both the size and strength of the lungs were impacted by proximity to oil drilling. We know that climate change and the ignition sources are leading to more frequent and catastrophic wildfires. And we've seen that in California, across California. And these really operate on different geographic and time factors. But we do know that wildfire size and the length of the fire season itself is increasing. And so we have a lot to learn still about the long-term health consequences of this very recent wildfire disaster. We do know that the hazardous air quality in the days surrounding the fires was significant news, and communities that were already burdened with health consequences of living near pollution had a much greater and risk of things like asthma burdens or respiratory harm from this new source of pollution from the wildfire smoke. Wildfires impact health, housing, personal wealth, community cohesion, as Maya has faced, and vulnerable communities are really less able to cope with these harms. They lack financial resources, and many of these can be linked with historical injustice. So we know from emerging research that already cumulatively burdened communities are often home to more oil and gas operations, and there's been an increase in the number of wells in wildfire burn areas. So living nearby wells can pose a higher exposure to wildlife threatened wells in the long term. And in the wake of the wildfires, I was asked by tenants associations and mutual aid organizations that really didn't have insurance, and landlords weren't cleaning up houses. And what there's been a lot of mutual aid trying to think about how do we purchase PPE that we then can share, and then should people be cleaning up their own spaces, and people really feel like they have no choice, that their landlord's not doing it, they live there, it's not a building that they still own rent, and they can't move out, they have nowhere else to go. And so people are cleaning up their own houses, and we're faced with the heavy metal pollution and other things that settle in the soil. In the aftermath, a lot of the people who live farther, the air pollution subsides, but the heavier stuff settles into the ground. And cleaning up, there's a whole protocol. And the reason insurance exists and it's so expensive is because it's a very time-intensive process. And so I know in communities in Pasadena and Altadena, there were these mutual aid groups, and they still exist, that are renting out PPE or lending it out. And then people are learning to clean their own homes. And so this is kind of the status with insurance, really thinking about retracting. I think we need to really stabilize that insurance market and think about long-term health protections for tenants in particular, and also to get insurance more widely available. So these are crises that are converging. It's like 100 years of drilling in LA, and then we're now seeing these wildfire catastrophes. And so I think we have to think about them together.
Yeah, indeed, Bhavna. I mean, with the health surveys that have been done in frontline communities, basically recording all the health impacts from oil drilling, and now to be compounded with what's been happening with the wildfires. And what we're seeing is increasingly worse climate disasters. Definitely something. And in fact, to bring it back, like that's who we are as STAND-L.A, right? We are here where impacted community residents and advocates are really working to stop this harm, to reverse it, and to bring some sort of healing to these communities, much in the vein of what Iretha said and what Ashley said as well. So Ashley, actually over to you. Can you talk to us a bit about how this community-led advocacy effectively can influence local policy and environmental regulations?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone here just also is rooted in the fact that every community in LA has a foot in this fight. Whether you're from Wilmington or South Central or Altadena, like the reality of oil drilling and the climate crisis is definitely encroaching on all of us. And, I think one of the things that's really important about community-led work is that we're able to set that precedent and evoke change for communities that really just haven't had that grace period and justice. Like, you all been talking about how long it's taken for us to begin developing and learning about a lot of this work. And communities living on the front lines have been like the birds in the mines, right? Like the canaries in the mines, right? Breathing in all of this stuff and really learning, right? How can we make our communities better? How can we be healthier? And that expertise, I think, is really necessary. I think there's a need for folks in LA to tap into this fight, even if you're not in a frontline setting. If you're an ally, if you're a supporter, if you're a donor, there is absolutely an opportunity for us to continue to build this movement in our city. And I think for me, this kind of work is transformational, right? We have policies and regulations in our city and in our state that are saying we care about the public health of people living near these sites. And I think what we need is the backing of a lot of folks that believe in that, right? We can't just wish it into existence. We have to take action. And so that's really what I want to encourage. I encourage folks, especially right now in the climate that we're in. People are trying to come at advocates, trying to intimidate and bully protesters and advocates in many different social aspects. And I feel like this one is one that we have to hold on to and make sure all of our experts come in, whether it's frontline experts, academic, and really continue to build and support the folks on the front lines, right? I think a lot of the work that folks like Bhavna and Maya have done has been uplift the voices of people on the front lines, organizing as well, right? That's been my role for a long time, is how do I uplift all of this great research we have, all of these great networks and relationships and information, and how do we bring it back to community? Because as great as it is that, spaces like STAND-L.A are out here organizing, we need all hands on deck to make sure that Los Angeles is protected, especially when we see, how easily a judge could overturn years worth of advocacy. We passed the STAND-L.A policy ordinance in 2022 in the middle of a pandemic. And our community members were so galvanized and so encouraged to participate in advocacy during a period where their health was dealing with an extreme burden, right? We already were dealing with a health crisis. Now we have a whole pandemic that we have to deal with, right? And so, I think organizing and community-led movements have really set a model for what we can continue to do. Like you can try to lock us away, you can try to intimidate us, you can try to tell us that we don't have the resources, but we have the power. And that's really what we're trying to build here is power with all of our allies, with all of our frontline residents, with all of the academics, with all of the physicians, and make something happen to really transform the life of all Angelenos, and to make sure we continue to get ready for these climate catastrophes that are going to continue to happen, right? Specifically in frontline communities, we see frontline communities being hit first and the hardest. And, the LA fires, as it was mentioned earlier, were so devastating to communities, and it just added that other layer of burden to not just the county, but the city, especially those that already had bad air quality. So, we definitely want to make sure that folks that feel invested in this work, and our residents from our communities speak out and organize with us, and make sure your council members, make sure your community loved ones and so on are able to be a part of this growing movement.
Yes, that last piece actually certainly brought a smile to my face. We'll be doing that. But Ashley, our next question is also for you, just following up with what you've been talking about already. Can you talk a little bit about the progress the city has made on transitioning away from fossil fuels? And can you tell us a little about the citywide oil drilling phase-out ordinance that passed in 2022 that we keep talking about, and why it was passed?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a massive uphill battle. I've been a part of the STAND-L.A for a good minute too. And I think when I first started doing this work, we were talking about setbacks. We were talking about health and safety buffers for folks living on the front lines. And it was this collaborative effort that really came out and affirmed the reality of frontline folks and continued to push for our communities to be protected and to be prioritized, that ultimately the city agreed with us. And they said, why don't we just do phase outs? And of course, right, that is the solution. We want to make sure that neighborhood oil drilling isn't a thing of our future, it's a thing of our past. And it's really because of the collaborative nature of again, STAND-L.A allies, supporters. Again, we did this during we've been fighting for this for over a good decade, and some change. And so throughout this work, we've seen the ups and downs. We've seen judges have just recently challenged us, but this is nothing new, like this is nothing new when you are fighting big oil. They are going to sue the city. They are going to try to sue whatever entities they can in order to delay progress. And I think that's what should set that fire with all of us here, is they're trying to undermine our democracy. They're trying to undermine our efforts to make our lives better because they want to continue to make money off of our lives. And so this collaborative effort that allowed all of these different sectors to come together, I think is why our ordinance was able to make it from, 15-foot setback in the city of LA to now a full city phase out. We had a council member here back in the day that he had a pretty closed door policy with us. He didn't like talking to us about oil because it always came about that funding could be removed from a specific entity. And, for frontline groups and nonprofit groups and volunteer-based groups, when you're dangling money in front of us and telling us, oh, well, we have money here, we can do with very little. We're resilient communities, we're resilient in what we can do. And I think one of the things that we've learned is that even if a council member like the one that we had doesn't support us vocally, we can apply that pressure, we can apply that strategy and ultimately get them to change their opinion. When we had our final city council vote in the middle of the pandemic, while we were calling in, trying to make sure folks were keeping this ordinance alive, our council member voted in agreement to the city phase out. So all of this closed door, reality, this closed door reality that they had with us, it ultimately was just another factor that we continue to push through. And ultimately we got unanimous votes in the entire city council for this ordinance. And, again, it's that pressure applied and that power bill. I think we can't leave this space without recognizing that we've been building an extreme amount of power, and we have a network and a movement here that we can't let big oil or judges or, you know, new politicians, you know, undermine. We have to continue to push, especially if we have supporters in the council that are willing to work with us. And so, you know, this is definitely speaking to, you know, folks' commitment and heart to this work for sure.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ashley. So, folks, if you didn't pick up this motion we're talking about that the judge overturned, but for which we still have a pathway to have it readopted, is to phase out oil drilling in the city of LA. And specifically, the motion said that it basically declared oil drilling an incompatible land use and banned new drilling and ban new drilling, and it phases out existing drilling within 20 years. Now, there are various other components that are accompanying this in other motions, but we won't be going into those details just yet. But this is the main piece, and this is why we're having this webinar today, to really draw the connection between why it's so urgent to have this ordinance readopted, especially in the wake of the wildfires we've had and in the worsening climate crisis that we're seeing. So with that, actually, Maya, back to you. You know, this groundbreaking law was recently overturned, as we've said in the courts. Can you tell us more about the legal grounds for the repeal of the original ordinance and discuss the legal and community implications and risks associated with the repeal?
Sure. So the issue in this, so basically what happened was the city passed this oil ordinance, and as Rabeya said, it basically declared wells a non-conforming use such that they would have to phase out within the next couple of decades. It also included some bans on certain types of maintenance that are really dangerous, like acidizing, so that companies couldn't use that near neighborhoods because that is, they use a ton of chemicals, some like that Bhavna mentioned earlier. So of course the oil companies sued, and they brought all sorts of claims. And so the litigation was divided up into phases. And the issue in the first phase of the litigation was that they argued that state law that regulated oil and gas preempted local governments from being able to restrict or phase out drilling. So basically state law was the only one that could say basically phase out drilling, or that state law was the only thing that could say you can stop drilling. The California Supreme Court had just recently come down with a ruling that the oil industry said confirmed this view. And unfortunately, the trial court agreed. So just AB 3233 was a state bill that was actually passed last year. And it clarified that this is in fact not the case, that state law does not preempt local governments from regulating and phasing out drilling. But unfortunately, the law was signed just a few weeks too late. The case had already been decided. So the city was in a little bit of a bind. So the city decided that it's going to go ahead and try to readopt the ordinance. But first, it has to repeal the existing one since the court said it was illegal. So that's what the city is in the process of doing. They're going to repeal the ordinance and then try to readopt a new one. Now, many of the drill sites in the city of LA are within a statewide health and safety buffer that was passed a few years ago. That buffer is 3,200 feet. So oil companies shouldn't be able to drill new wells or get permits to rework existing wells. So like there might be a well that's a producing well and they want to make it an injection well, or it might be idle and they want to make it producing again. They can't do any of that within the health and safety buffer. But the oil companies have argued that they can still do dangerous things like the acid maintenance and other types of maintenance that maintain the life of the wells. So it would be really important for the city to also adopt health and safety measures to protect the community from these types of activities, maybe a potential moratorium on acidizing, restrictions on dust, truck traffic, noise, lighting, and other nuisances. robust monitoring and notification requirements for spills, fires, and other accidents. And it's also important for the city to start thinking about how to ensure that oil companies are cleaning up their messes at the site so that they don't endanger community members. Oil drilling is actually declining and toward the end of its lifespan in the state. And the city should be enacting and enforcing remediation requirements to make sure that taxpayers aren't left on the hook to pay for these things if the oil companies essentially split. Sometimes they'll declare bankruptcy and just leave the oil wells, and they're still really dangerous even when they're not in use. They leak all kinds of chemicals in that case too.
Okay. Thanks for that, Maya. I guess if you would like to just a bit more, can you tell us like the critical elements necessary for a legally robust oil phase-out ordinance moving forward?
So yeah, so the city is definitely going to have to make sure that the ordinance complies with all the relevant laws. And now, fortunately, they have AB 3233 in their belt. They will have to support their decision to phase out drilling with really robust evidence of the harms of urban oil drilling, of which there's plenty of information, and lots of it is from Bhavna. So that is very, very helpful. It could also consider incorporating some of the safety and cleanup measures that I mentioned before. And when it does go through and readopt this ordinance, it's going to have to do some level of environmental review under the California Environmental Quality Act, which will take a little bit of time. And it's also going to have to go back through all the city committees, like the city council committees, before the full city council can vote on it again. So it has a little while before they'll be able to readopt the ordinance.
Right. Making sure we do it right so it's as strong as possible. Trade-off is that it will take some time.
The more information that they have supporting harms, the better they will be. Yeah.
Thanks, Maya. You know, listening to you and listening to Ashley, I keep going back to those early years of STAND-L.A. And Bhavna, I think you were part of this too, you know, where we were talking about this, and it seemed like the very first fight we had to have with the city was even getting the then city council to even agree that public health is more important than industry profit. You know, that's what was driving them. Like, how do we protect industry profits? And Ashley, to your point, you know, that's where so much of the community organizing and community-led advocacy came in, because it was constantly uplifting and telling the stories of what was happening to impacted community members. You know, that finally like changed this dominant paradigm from one of protecting industry profits to one of actually seeing their role as, you know, protecting public health. And once that happened, right, this radical idea that human health is actually more important than, you know, money, it felt inevitable. They could no longer deny that the logical next step was to phase out oil drilling. But even with all of that, you know, Bhavna, can you tell us what other pathways policymakers and public health officials need to take to address environmental justice through policy outside of the readoption of the oil phase-out ordinance?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So while there is this really important effort to readopt the ordinance, drilling continues every day, right? So there's really good data on something that in the literature is called the hierarchy of controls. So thinking about, you know, there's lots of health protective actions we must take in the interim, knowing that there's these public health consequences from drilling. And places like Wilmington, you know, really do have the entire chain of oil production, all the way from extraction to the pipelines, to the refining and transport. So it's a whole chain, you know, in some places. And we have to sort of think about, you know, what is the best possible health and safety measures we can take in the interim. So, you know, the phase out is really the most health protective that the city and county could take. But in the absence of this, or in the interim, they really need to be the public health agencies and the regulatory agencies have to really require engineering controls that are put in place to reduce the release and intensity of impacts on communities living near drilling. So this is things like noise protections, ensuring communities are notified when there's hazardous drill maintenance or other operations. Some of the things that Maya mentioned around, not allowing some of these hazardous practices that are ongoing, like acid maintenance, ensuring that there are walls or other barriers that we see in wealthier communities. In lower income communities, we know that low income communities of color have less protections. They're less enforcement, they're closer to the wells, they're not covered. Pollution in wealthier places is piped out. And that, in communities that are facing some of these constant, impacts, that there's the rigs and other equipment is electrified to reduce pollution that comes from any vehicles coming in and out or being used on site. So there's really a long list of things. I think some that Maya mentioned, and some that are none of which are happening. In some places there's some that are happening, and in other places none. And I think there needs to be some sort of really continuous and consistent set of practices that all communities benefit from in any interim that we have.
Thank you, Bhavna. In the last 7 minutes we have for this, I have one more question for Ashley and then a question for all of you. Ashley, what concrete next steps should communities and policymakers take to ensure the successful readoption of a robust oil phase-out ordinance?
I think right now one of the most important things for folks to do is it's frankly remain committed to this work, right? One of the things that I feel we have an uphill battle with every single time when we're doing policy is making sure we have the support from our city council representatives. And so, I think one of the main things that I want to make sure folks are able to do is make sure that we are communicating and sharing our stories and our realities as frontline residents. We want to make sure that communities of color and frontline communities are not deprioritized, especially as we're talking about like the urgency of rebuilding. The time to, be locked into this work is now. We can't let this moment pass us. This is the moment right now where we have to put the pressure and make the connections and build the relationship. And so if you're here new to STAND-L.A, this is the space where you want to be making connections, right? We have community-based groups, environmental groups that have a massive fountain of information and have been strong allies to this work. We want to make sure that we have a healthier LA for everyone, and that really comes through advocacy. And so I really just, especially with our youth members and our adult members that we work with, we want to continue to encourage folks to share what they're experiencing on the front lines of oil and gas, right? Bring these stories to your council members, bring these stories to the folks that can help us make these changes happen, right? We know that we have been, we've been at least aware that changes happen in city council, and we're up to make sure we're educating and building that relationship and those networks. And we need folks like you all, that may also have some of these relationships and expertise to really support us. We also want to make sure that you're, supporting any oil and gas regulation that you see coming up about, if any local groups and organizations that are committed to environmental justice work or doing public health work, if there's any oil and gas regulations, that can aid our fight, putting that call in to our council members, putting that call in to make sure that we get what we need, right? And that really comes from speaking out of what's happening in our communities. And so, as we try to rebuild and make everything romantic again for our city, it's really nice seeing all the commercials about like, we're going to rebuild LA. We can't rebuild LA equitably if we leave the front lines that are living on oil and gas wait in line. And that's what we're trying to make sure that doesn't happen right now. This is the urgent moment. This is the moment right now. We want to make sure we continue to build this movement forward to get this policy, this ordinance passed before the end of the year, right? Like I know as a resident, that's my goal. I don't want to see these delays happen time and time and time again, because we don't have time to wait. Not only does our climate have its own timeline, but you know, a lot of our community members know it's not a matter of if, but when, right? When will I get sick? And you know, I think right here it's the moment where we remind you all that we have an opportunity to advocate to policymakers, and also, you know, as community members, be the leaders that we don't always see being elected.
Thanks, Ashley. Thank you so much for that. A question for everyone, or all of you, panelists. As you think about all of the things we need to do, the phase out ordinance, rebuilding homes after the fires, what is the vision that you have for our city?
Who should go? Do you get? Well, I'll just start. So as Bhavna said, there's so many intersecting issues that this is all brought up. I mean, first things first, we have to stop making the problem worse. We have to end the era of fossil fuels, of drilling, especially starting with urban frontline communities like Ashley was talking about, and just stop burning fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy and more climate resilient communities. In Altadena, I think we need to ensure that everyone who lived there before, including people without insurance, can build back safer with proper materials and tiny mesh vents, and to be able to maintain the generational equity that people have built up in their homes over so many years. We should be building back without gas, because if we build back all electric, and especially if we prioritize community solar and microgrids, it's actually cheaper and better than having both gas and electric for the climate. And it creates more resilient communities that don't rely on power lines that cause fires, or people having to pay utility service fees. And we also need to make sure everyone has safe evacuation routes, gets timely notice. West Altadena was historically the Black area, got notice that was far too late. And as other people said, make sure renters have protections after fires so that people aren't pushed out of housing because they can't afford remediation. And here's just one little shameless plug. We can make fossil fuel polluters pay to rebuild the communities by supporting the Polluters Pay Climate Superfund bill that a lot of us are sponsoring in Sacramento. These are SB 684 and AB 1243, and under this bill, at least 40% of the fees paid by mega polluting oil companies would go to transforming environmental justice communities. Sorry I had to do it. I'm in Sacramento doing briefings on it right now.
Great, Maya. Bhavna?
Yeah, let Ashley go. You know, I think Maya's really important point is that I think we really need to think about phasing out oil use and gas use. I think we have the capacity to do it, and we have to build the political will to do it. And a lot of the data supports that phasing out the use of fossil fuels is really important. So I recognize that there's lots of questions around this. How will it happen? And I think there are many concerns that are always raised when you bring this up, but I think that the consequences of not doing it are just so vast that we need to think about those first, and then think about charting the path forward and bringing every community that's really both tethered to oil and gas, as an economic support, and also living in the shadow of oil and gas along, right? So that's kind of a really important vision. And I think we keep the vision centered, even if the work is plodding and it feels plodding sometimes. And I think organizing, I really have to speak to my own work, I'm really interested in good data, and good data that is tethered to strong organizing. I think other people have heard me say this, but like one study that many studies that sit like in peer review on a shelf are really not effective. Good studies, good research that is in the hands of effective communities is really important. And so I think as an academic, on the academic side, I'm really committed to sort of building that and continuing to support the data collection. And it's not, we know that data is something that is powerful. We don't, make it up. We find what we find. We examine questions, and not all questions are researchable. Some things are not researchable, and so really being able to parse through what is and what's not is the work that I sort of see myself doing, and working in partnership with organizing. So I mean, I think it's both the short and the long term that we have to think about these issues.
Thanks, Bhavna. Ashley, do you want to bring us home on this?
I mean, I think my vision for my city is one that actually commits to seeing the promises to frontline communities through. That's my vision, is, making sure these promises aren't broken. Time and time again, I think our communities are told, wait in line, wait for your turn. And I think a lot of folks in this space have the sentiment that we've been waiting long enough. We've been dealing with these, with really deep traumas related to environmental injustice. And a lot of the time, right, it's business as usual, just keep on going. And, I think for me, that's a key part of the future for our city, is one that has already phased out oil drilling, that is taking a stance in protecting the health of others, and that we ourselves as people that are impacted are turning out and coming out for one another, right? I think ultimately, we have to advocate to elected officials, but I think one of the most necessary parts of this work is building that community power, and being able to support one another through this work. We could be from Wilmington or from South LA, or in this case, that's the reality with our STAND-L.A. work, and we're going to come out and turn out for one another in the moments that are necessary, right? And I think that's my vision for a city, is a city that has our residents care for one another and turn out for one another, because no one, that's really it, right? It's how Asada says, we only have our chains to lose. And, for any groups that are interested in this kind of work, become supporters. If you're interested in becoming a champion and speaking of this, of how you are impacted by the climate crisis, by how you are impacted by environmental injustice, or how you are sick of seeing frontline communities being overburdened with pollution. There's definitely so much that we can create together to make our city better. And I think my vision for it is one where we don't have to be afraid to take a deep breath, because fossil fuels is gone, and we have invested in a lot of clean alternative energy and have created a ton of jobs, and everyone is much happier because of it, and we're not getting sick. So I think, to me, it's all of the hopeful wishing and all the hopeful karma that I have for this work. We've passed an ordinance despite every obstacle, despite every opposition out there coming out of the woodwork. We've had folks, try to really call out STAND-L.A, and we've remained firm that we want to protect folks from the impacts of neighborhood oil drilling. And until we reach that future, we're not going to stop to protect the city of LA.
Yes, exactly, Ashley. Thank you. We actually are now going to move over to some of the questions we've received from all of you in the audience. Unfortunately, we don't have as much time, so we won't be able to get to all the questions, but we'll get started and go with that. I think the first question, Maya, might be over to you, but others feel free to step in. Does STAND-L.A support or do work with communities that live near oil drilling sites in unincorporated LA County? And this person said, I live near where Ashley lives, but in an unincorporated area.
Sure. I mean, I can answer and throw it to Ashley too. So STAND-L.A is part of a coalition that does work on oil drilling in LA County. This coalition pushed the county to actually pass a very similar ordinance as the city after the city passed its ordinance. The oil industry again sued. Again, it was phased into this multiple phases, and preemption was the issue in the first phase. And AB 32 was passed right before oral argument in this case. And so the counties actually decided to go the same route as the city and try to repeal the existing ordinance and then readopt a new one. So they're kind of on parallel tracks. Yeah, Ashley, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I mean, what's happening here in the city is setting a precedent that, you know, county and state hopefully follow. And I think, you know, it's so funny because when I remember when I was first getting into this work, that was what I was being told. It's like, you know, this could start here and you know, grow elsewhere. And, you know, it's actually happening. You know, we've been talking about like fires, but, you know, this work has been catching like fire, quite literally. You know, I think when I first started doing this work, people would shut the door at our faces and not want to talk to us about this work. And the more and more we continue to have these real conversations about how you are being impacted by the oil and gas industry, particularly by oil drilling, the more folks are connecting the dots, right? And I think once we're able to really connect the dots and see the whole picture, we're seeing that a lot of us are being impacted by this infrastructure, health-wise, climate-wise, environmentally. And so it's really, you know, impressive, and, you know, it speaks to the work that STAND-L.A and all of our partners have, because, you know, we may be doing this work in the city of LA, but we definitely have partners that are doing some deep work in the Inglewood oil field. You know, Black Women for Wellness have been really like pushing and leading just an amazing effort. And so, you know, this definitely is a collaborative effort, as we were saying earlier. It's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us. And so if you live in an unincorporated area, you are not in any way forgotten. I think we definitely recognize that, yeah, we have jurisdictions and limits, but we want to make sure that Wilmington and South LA aren't the only neighborhoods that are eliminating fossil fuels and neighborhood oil drilling, but we want to make sure this happens to all communities dealing with neighborhood oil drilling.
Thanks. And we'll do one more question, which is, how can community organizations support existing efforts around oil drilling and environmental justice, and other existing efforts here in LA, particularly in South LA?
You know, I think there's definitely a lot of, you know, especially within STAND-L.A, there's community-based groups that are leading work in respective areas. I know I'm all the way in Wilmington, but we definitely have folks from Scope that are dealing with some, you know, doing some incredible work out in the South LA area. You know, I think the most important thing for folks to do, especially community organizations, is become supporters, become allies. If you haven't signed on to any letters, if you haven't shared petitions with your community members, these are those moments where we want to make sure we activate them, right? Not only to STAND-L.A, but also to the actual action, right? Which is telling city council right now, we need to repass this ordinance. And we want to make sure that this ordinance, or at least that the cleanup of land doesn't take too long, right? And so that's really the goal with any information that we're passing around right now, is just trying to inform folks on all of these different elements in order to make sure we have an ordinance that gets passed and, you know, doesn't get struck down again. But, you know, if you're definitely interested, continue to encourage folks to seek out resources from STAND-L.A and STAND-L.A partner groups, and, you know, turning out to our events, you know, when we have webinars like this one, sharing it out to the masses, when we have, you know, this year we're going to have a lot of city council, you know, we're going to have to go back and speak to our representatives. And these are those moments where y'all should come out and, right, they should hear from you all, not just from, you know, like us panelists here, but really from the city. They need to feel the heat, right? Like we feel it every day. We don't get to clock out, and they should be confronted with the realities that frontline residents are too. So if you want to be a part of that and bring that, bring that energy, definitely feel free to make the connection here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Ashley. I believe that brings us to the end of the audience questions. And we're going to close with a few calls to action for all of you. So. So as you can see, we have this petition here for all of you to sign. You can scan the QR code and go directly there. You can go to our website, find it there, and also sign up for our mailing list. So please do that. And we just want to say thank you. Thank you to all of us for joining. Thank you to our panelists, Ashley, Maya, and Bhavna. Thank you so much for sharing the wealth of your experience with us and sharing with us, what everyone can do next to fight for environmental justice. It was really quite something to hear all of it. And of course, thank you to Assemblymember Brian. For everyone who joined us today, we'll be sending a follow-up email with the resources and a recording of the webinar. So thank you again. Thank you.